G'day Guardians, it's Matt here, and today I have a really fun Arc 3.0 Titan build that has cemented its place as one of my go-to neutral game builds when playing Destiny 2. It may not be the most flashy build, but the things that it does different to most Arc Titan builds at the moment, it does really well. I know when you think of Arc 3.0 for Titans, the first thing that comes to most of our crayon-eating brains is Thunder Crash and Storm Nades, especially with all the hype surrounding them at the moment. But I have something different to offer. I'm not here to reinvent the 50th different variant of the Storm Nades build that's been circulating, so if that's what you're looking for, well, I've got some bad news for you. But if you do stick around, I know that you won't be disappointed with how much fun you're going to have with this build. I kind of view this build as a bit of a foundation. It's really flexible, and if there's some parts that you'd like to change around with it, you'll absolutely be able to, and it'll still work fine. At its core, you'll have infinite melee uptime, and yes, you can choose either of the three melee options, Thunderclap, Seismic Strike, or Ballistic Slam. You'll also be receiving two different forms of health regeneration, which means that you don't need to play safe at all, and you'll be able to apply 3 different damage buffs to your melee of choice, making them feel like mini supers. But I will show you later in the video how we can actually apply 5 different damage buffs to our melee, which I know sounds absolutely absurd, but it's totally doable and it's really killer. And lastly, we'll be applying 2 different damage buffs to our weapons as well, so we'll basically be like the Titan equivalent of a Terminator. And yes, even though I was bullying Storm Nades a little bit earlier, you can run them in this build because I do, and they're absolutely busted right now, so why should we ignore them? And this build will cause those Storm Nades to roam around and jolt enemies as well. But before we jump into it, I wanted to mention a cheeky little giveaway that Roguey and I are going to be running through this video. Thanks to the amazing Australia and New Zealand Destiny 2 team, we're able to give away one of these really cool Arc-themed speakers to celebrate the Arc 3.0 rework that dropped this season. In addition to that, we'll also be giving the winner a Sienta Illuminata emblem code as well. There's zero chance that I pronounced that correctly. So to enter, all you need to do is just subscribe and turn that notification bell on. Drop a like on the video, and leave a comment about what your favourite part of Season of the Plunder has been so far. For me personally, the Hunter's new Arc Super is just too damn cool, and it just takes the cake for me. If you're in the mood to test your luck, we're also actually giving away a Follow the Light emblem code over on Twitter at the moment. Link to that one will be in the description, and is separate from the speaker one. Alright, let's get back to the build. Now, for the exotic of choice, if it didn't click to you automatically when I mentioned infinite melee energy earlier on, then it is the Insurmountable Skull Fort. Now, before you jump to your guns and say, come on Matt, Insurmountable Skull Fort is just infinite melee energy refunds on kill, how is that a build? Well, bear with me, because yes, while that's true, since it's actually just the exotics perk, we've actually built around this to make something a little more substantial with a little bit more happening. If you're already an Insurmountable Skull Fort fan, congratulations. I think you're probably one of the 10 Guardians that I've seen use this exotic in the last 2 years. But don't worry, that's just because Curious of the Falling Star wanted all the limelight. We've evolved now. If you're new to Destiny, then Insurmountable Skull Fort is specifically used for the Arc subclass, where Arc melee kills fully recharge your melee ability back, and also begin health regeneration. You can essentially just throw this exotic on and have a fantastic time, which again, most players I come across have completely forgotten about, or just plain disregard it because it's a little bit older. You can run around ballistic slamming adds from the sky over and over again with a completely refunded slam after each kill, or maybe you enjoy clapping some sorry, I meant thunder, with how strong this is. No string of commands is necessary here to enjoy this exotic's perk, but you damn well better believe we're going to enhance this experience with the right fragments, mods, and weapons. Alright, so let's dive into this juicy Arc 3.0 subclass rework and take a look at everything that we need to run to make this build work. First things first, choose whichever super, grenade, class ability, jump, and melee that you'd like. There's no right or wrong option here. I'm still a bit of a Thunder Crash fan, so it stays on. Storm Nades are ridiculous regardless if you're running Heart of Inmost Light, so I'm still using those as well. And for me, I see this build as a bit of a movement improvement for Titan. My personal own fantasy for this build is just to make it as quick as possible so I can dash in and out for melee kills, so I'd recommend using thrusters and Seismic Strike, but again, it's completely up to you. The first aspect to run is Touch of Thunder, which if you're running Storm Nades will create that roaming thundercloud that tracks targets. While it doesn't offer a whole lot to the build, it does offer an extra fragment slot than Juggernaut does, which again felt even more useless for the build since we generate heals on melee kills. Which by the process of elimination means our second aspect is Knockout, which increases our melee damage and range when we break an enemy's shield or critically wound them, but it also offers our second source of healing whilst making us amplified as well. As for the fragments, there's a few different ways that you can lean with this. I think Spark of Resistance is just a no-brainer for that extra survivability, especially if you feel like absolutely sending it on the pack of ads, just meleeing them all to death. Spark of Feedback is just one of the damage buffs that we can stack onto our melee. All it requires is that we get meleeed first. I never normally try to proc this, it just passively happens when you're diving into packs of ads. Now for the last 2 remaining slots, I do actually recommend 4 different fragments, so I want you to play around your style. If you don't care too much about being amplified and having that effect from our melee kills, then I would recommend using Spark of Magnitude for extra long storm nades and Spark of Shock for the storm nades to be able to jolt enemies. But if you do enjoy having that amplified effect, then I would slot in Spark of Beacons, where our arc special weapons blind enemies, and Spark of Amplitude, where kills while amplified makes orbs of power, which comes in handy to get our super back faster. It also procs some mods and helps teammates with their builds as well if they need orbs. Speaking of proccing mods, let's discuss the mods that you need for this build. First up, a melee Wellmaker will generate an arc well each time we get a melee kill, and since we have a never-ending cooldown with our insurmountable Skull Fort, we'll have wells for days. If you've got an Artifice set of arms, then you can take advantage of 3 copies of Focusing Strike, which refunds a huge chunk of class ability energy for each melee, which for me is amazing since I love the flexibility that Thruster gives in combat. With that elemental well we're generating with each melee kill, it's going to do a few things for us. It's going to give us Font of Might, a cool 25% damage buff on our arc weapons, and if you decide to run that fragment I mentioned earlier, those arc special weapons can become blinding weapons that dish out mean damage. But it doesn't stop there. That arc elemental well is also going to make us charge with light through elemental charge, which will feed us high energy fire, an additional 20% damage buff for our weapons that stacks on top of Font of Might. So we now sit in a scenario where our infinite melee spam can feed our arc weapons with 2 different damage buffs, while also having these weapons blind enemies too if we like. I'd also just recommend a copy of Innovation on our legs for a faster grenade cooldown when collecting an orb as well. And lastly, that singular arc elemental well from the beginning that we generate from our melee will also proc Well of Ions, which will provide our next melee with an increase in damage. I'd also recommend using both of the weapon trait improvement mods, Bottomless Bounty 1 and 2, which I'll touch on a little bit later in the video in the weapons section. Now for the class item. I did quickly skim over it with Elemental Charge, and for a good reason. This is probably the most versatile part of the build, since all of our artifact mods seem to revolve around the class item. I'm personally utilizing the amplified part of the build a little bit more at the moment, so I'm rocking Amped Up for that huge increase in amplification time, and Thunderous Retort, which kind of substitutes Curious of the Falling Star's Thunder Crash damage. But if you did want to lean into grenades more, you could use Lightning Strikes twice, or Surge Detonators and Bad Amplitude if you're facing champions. It's really up to you and how you want to play this. As for the weapons to run with this, there's a few different options to go. If you want to stack 2 extra damage buffs on your melee, totaling out at 5 damage buffs, and if I've lost you, those come from Well of Ions, Spark of Feedback, and the Knockout Fragment. Well then, you could just run Tractor Cannon to debuff your opponents before meleeing them. I know that's not technically a buff and more of a debuff, but you can also run Shotgun with 1-2 Punch on it. The Wasteland M5 from Dares of Eternity is a fan favorite, but any shotgun with that perk will do the job. For me though, Forbearance is an absolute staple with this build. With the 2 damage buffs on it with Font of Might and High Energy Fire, seeing it shred through Yellow Bar Knights with 1 shot is just so satisfying. And the fact that you can also blind enemies with that blinding fragment that I mentioned is absolutely insane. This is why the Bottomless Bounty mod is good, because the Soul Drinker perk will feed you health back on reload as well. Another pick that I wish that I could run, but unfortunately I'm 1 red border away, is Defiance of Yasmin. Yes, I actually want to run double special ammo with this build, since my melees will probably just kill everything. Defiance of Yasmin can roll with Osmosis, which is what I would craft with it, and Firing Line, meaning it too can benefit from my 2 damage buffs and also deal that blinding effect as well. Now, with how this build plays, I won't spend too much time on this because I've sort of been explaining it along the way. But the premise is, you'll have your infinite loop of melees thanks to the Exotics perk. Those melees will drop elemental wells. Those elemental wells will give your weapons 2 different damage buffs, your melee a damage buff, and will start the chain for this entire loop. Your fragments and aspects enhance your storm grenades. They provide additional melee damage and heals, as well as give your arc special weapons blinding capabilities if you lent that way. Like I mentioned, I find this build really fun for neutral gameplay because the melee has 100% uptime, the nades are strong, your Thunder Crash is buffed, and your weapons are absolutely jacked. Each point here does have a stronger counterpart, but that's the beauty of it being in the middle ground. It's reliable. It doesn't require the insane setup that Worm God requires for powerful melees, and while the Storm Nades aren't as powerful as Heart of Inmost Lights, red bars die to them regardless, and that's the trade-off with having an infinite melee. The Thunderous Retort mod sort of negates Curious of the Falling Star for this season too, so this build really is the best of everything here. Your gameplay loop will stop though if you melee an enemy and they don't die, in which case all you'll need to do is just wait for your melee cooldown. Would I take this build into a Grandmaster Nightfall or a Master Raid? Absolutely not. This build is mostly for low-end content like Gambit or Vanguard Strikes, or probably some of the lower Nightfall difficulties. The build is a lot of fun and it's really good at taking down red bars and even yellow bars, but on those higher difficulty activities you're going to have a hard time being able to kill those enemies even with the damage buffs on your melee. So stick to the easier content. This build is purely more for fun and entertainment, not so much practical for the higher end difficulties of the game. As for the stats on this build though, you absolutely don't need anything in strength, mobility, or recovery. We get the melee refunds, our seismic strike and thrusters give good movement, and we have 2 forms of health regeneration, so those 3 stats are pointless. I would try and max out resilience for survivability, plus we have a faster thruster cooldown, and discipline for more storm nades. Any remaining stat points that you have left over, I would just chuck them into intellect personally for that sweet, sweet thunder crash. But that's everything from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this build. Again, the way that I envision this build is it does a little bit of everything. It has strong storm nades still, great ability uptime, infinite cooldown on our melee, it's got great movement, and Thunderous Retort boosts that Thunder Crash damage a lot. It's the best of all worlds here in Universe Titan. Don't forget to enter the giveaway for your chance to win those ARC-themed speakers from the ANZ D2 team. Just sub to the channel with notifications on, like the video, and let us know in the comments what your favorite part of Season of the Plunder is. Big shoutouts to the members who support our channel. We are 2 members away from being able to showcase all of you on our channels page, which we would absolutely love to do. Take it easy, Guardians.